Hello, brothers. I didn't realize that when I scheduled the class for today that actually it's July 4th, which is a big holiday here in the US, or Independence Day. And so we'll be out looking at fireworks during what would have been our normal class time. So I apologize for that, but thought I would record the session again. So hopefully it will be helpful to you. And also, too, I want to combine the next two sessions together to do both the character analysis and the plot analysis, since those assignments are due very soon. So be able to do that. And then also, just by way of schedule, I will be out of the country uh, until August. So we won't meet again until beginning of August, because I will be in Turkey for a couple weeks and then Pakistan for a couple of weeks. So I won't be able to do the class. But again, though, if you have questions, you can text me, message me, email me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Just want to encourage you to know right now might be a challenge to stay with the assignments and keep at it, but please endure and keep pressing forward. Many of you are doing very well. I'm encouraged by that. So if you are a little behind, there's still plenty of time to catch up, but you need to make that effort now and plan for it now in order to be able to do that. So with that, let's go ahead, and I'm going to pray for this session, and then we'll get started. Lord, I do pray that you would bless this time together, that you would, Lord, give us understanding, wisdom to know your word, to understand it, to apply it. May your spirit be at work even now in this session as I'm recording it, that I would be clear and helpful, Lord, so that we may know you through what you have given us in your word, so that we may glorify you. We pray for the glory of your Son. Amen. Okay, well, let's get started here. What I'd like to do is go ahead and, like I said, we're going to focus our attention now on character analysis and then plot analysis. So those are the next two steps. We're in the narrative analysis portion of our study, and we just completed the scene analysis in our last session, setting analysis the session before that. And so now I want to work on character analysis, which will be for assignment 2.12. If you remember, we've done on the previous assignments, the last one was 2.11 for scene analysis. So this one, we're going to be looking at assignment 2.12, and then, Lord willing, be able to get through plot analysis, which is assignment 2.13. All right. So that's the goal for this session together that I'm recording here. And first, I want to just do for the plan here is we'll look at just do a quick review of the topic, and then we'll look at Genesis 39 as an example for that topic. So in this case, we're going to be examining character analysis. And so let's remind ourselves of the character analysis step. If you remember, there are basically three main characters in a story. The first is we call the protagonist. That's the overall main character. Some call the hero of the story, though the protagonist is not always a hero. But he's the main character, the focus of the story. And then the antagonist is the one who creates or causes or furthers, exaggerates the problem in the story. The antagonist opposes the protagonist. And so this tells us that it's important for the story to identify the problem of the story. We ultimately want to get to the point of the story. We ultimately want to understand what the author's message in the story is. But to get there, we need to understand the plot. And to get to the plot, we really need to see what the problem is in the story. And so as we look at the characters of the story, there's the protagonist, and then the antagonist is the one that creates or causes or increases the problem in the story. And so it's really important that we identify what is the problem in this story. And so that's going to help us tremendously in figuring out ultimately what the message of the story is through the plot. But as we look at the characters in the story, we have the protagonist, we have the antagonist who creates or furthers the problem in the story. And so you can think of it, I've drawn out this figure to kind of help us with that. For some reason, the protagonist, oh, maybe this is why. Nope. The protagonist is missing. Protagonist should be in this box here. Okay, and so this is just kind of a visual way to depict what I was just saying, that as you look at the story, the antagonist is the one who causes the problem for the protagonist. All right. Now, as we look ahead, though, that those aren't the only main characters. They're also often in the story are the characters referred to as the foil. And the purpose of this character is to highlight or draw attention to draw focus upon the other main characters, either the protagonist or the antagonist. And it's important to understand there usually are many characters in the story. All right, if you have a typical story, you're going to have lots of characters often. But not every character in the story is critical to understanding the point of the story. There's usually only, again, those three characters, the protagonist, the antagonist, and then these characters that are referred to as foils. And foils are in the story intentionally by the author to compare or contrast with the antagonist or the protagonist. That is, there's something about the foil that is drawing attention to one of the other two main characters, either by a comparison or by a contrast. I think I used the example in class of the woman at the well and the disciples, and that Jesus is the main character. The antagonist was the cultural expectations, the prejudice in the culture. And then really the woman and the disciples serve as foils, where the woman is carrying out the mission that Jesus intended for the disciples to understand. Jesus was on a mission to disclose, to share himself, to proclaim the gospel. And the woman is a comparison to that, in that she, when she believes Jesus is the Messiah, she rushes back to the village to share with them that the Messiah has come. And so she really is like a foil in comparison to Christ. Whereas the disciples, they are all too are a foil, but in the opposite sense, as a contrast, that they don't behave like the woman. They don't tell the people in the town that the Messiah has come. And so Jesus has to exhort them at the end of the story that they too are on the mission that he is on. And so, but then you have other characters like the Samaritans, the other Samaritans in the story. And those are important characters, but they're not key characters in the sense of either protagonist, antagonist, or foils. All right. So often you'll have in the story other characters that are just part of the story to sort of fill out the realism of the story, to fill out portions of the story that focus on the main characters. But not every character is significant in the sense of the author intending to use that character to communicate the main point in the story. So our focus is just going to be, again, on those three, on the protagonist, the antagonist, and the foil. Now, so you can think of it, and I drew the picture here to sort of represent that. We have the protagonist here, the antagonist who's creating the problem in the story, and then the foils, which are comparing or contrasting to one of the two main characters. Okay, so maybe I should extend this guy down a little to make that a little bit more clear. There. All right. Now, there are some other characters, if you will, in the story. The narrator, though he's not actually a character that's involved in the action of the dialogue of the story, but he's a part of the story, a significant part of the story, because he is the one who is the author revealing. The narrator sort of reveals key events, key thoughts, key actions in the story to point and direct us to what he wants us to see as the point of the story. All right. So pay attention. As I've said many times, the narrator is very, very important to understanding the story. And then finally, of course, the main character in every story is God himself. He obviously, the scriptures point to him. They're written by him. They're about him. So we want to not miss that. He's the central person. And Walt Kaiser's is a quote we read in class, but I think it's important to remind ourselves the central character of the Bible, he says, is God. This comes as no surprise, for in almost every narrative, God is present explicitly or by implication. Therefore, the interpreter and the expositor's attention must be centered on God's role in the narrative. This reminds us that all efforts to concentrate on the human character in the story while failing to locate God's action in the narrative are wrong. And what he's saying here is if we just give all of our attention to the human characters and we do not seek to understand what God is doing in the narrative, what the narrative reveals about him, then we've missed it. All right. So what that does is it leads to divorcing the character from God's larger redemptive plan, bypassing the point the author was making. Accordingly, one of our key questions in determining the characterization of a narrative is, what is God doing in this scene? All right. Often one can give so much attention in the story to the human characters that the main character, God, is often forgotten. And so then the point of the story is missed. So we don't want to do that. Okay. So with that said, let's look now at the process or the procedure to doing character analysis. First step is read through the story again and make observations. Now, I know we've already done this. We did this when we did the setting, but I think it's helpful at this point just to read through again, maybe look at some other translations. New things may pop out to you. Again, this step of observation is very important in Bible study and one that's often neglected, not given much attention to. But I think it's really important because the more we focus ourselves and draw out ourselves observations, I think the more the story we will remember it and we see things within it. And so I encourage us to spend a little bit of time to, again, just read through the story a few more times, make some observations. There may not be many, but it's important at this stage, after you've done the setting analysis, the scene analysis, to take another time of reading through it a few times. And then secondly, identify and categorize each character. That is, identify the protagonist, the antagonist, and if there are foils in the story. And then the third step, this is the most significant step, and that is to identify the key dialogue and actions for each character, each main character, and then identify any other features of a character that seem important to the story, and then important statements by the narrator. And then the fourth step is identify God's role in the story. What does the story tell about him? All right, so we're covering all the key characters, right? The protagonist, the antagonist, the foils. Then we're looking at the narrator comments, and then, of course, that lastly, identify God's role in the story. Okay, so let's do that for Genesis 39. We've been using this story as our example. We've looked at the setting analysis and then the scene analysis. So let's now do this for the character analysis. I'm going to go ahead and read the text, and then we'll jump right into looking at the character analysis within the story. Okay, so begins. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he had left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now, If you remember, this was the introduction to the story, and the scene analysis, we looked at this and just saw that, some period of time had passed here, maybe several years, and God was with him and had elevated Joseph to the manager of the whole household. Verse 7. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house. And he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Now, this was the first scene of the story. Again, the focus here is on, now we see the problem developing, don't we? Potiphar's wife wants to have sex with Joseph, and Joseph, of course, refuses, recognizing the great sin it would be against God and against his master. Verse 11. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, none of the men of the house was there in the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard me, that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. Well, so now we see the problem increased, right? She claims Joseph had raped her because he refused her advances. Verse 16. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him, put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. Keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So here we see again in this final part of the story, Joseph is thrown in prison. Potiphar believes his wife instead of Joseph, despite Joseph's example, puts him in prison. And again, we see the theme just as the story began. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord prospered Joseph, granted him favor so that he was put in charge of the prison even. And this sets up the next story that we would get to in chapter 40. Okay, so for this story, let's consider then. Normally, read through this several times, read through the other translations. There was a few observations that I came up with when I did that. I noticed in the ESV, it has laugh at. Remember when she says he brought this Hebrew to laugh at us? The New American Standard says make sport of. The Net Bible has humiliate. New King James has mock. So kind of these other translations give the idea that by her accusation that he tried to rape her was really showing disrespect and dishonor to them, and that this Hebrew, this foreigner, has come in and shown such dishonor. That's mocking us. Verse 20, I noticed he was thrown in jail where the king's prisoners were. Was this place a better jail than the normal jail? Why was he put there where the king's prisoners were placed instead of in a normal prison? So that was something that came up to me. And then also verse 20 tells me, I seem to set up the next chapter, because it tells us then, since he's in the king's prison, that's why he met later in the next story, the baker and the cupbearer. All right, so those are just a few more observations that came to my mind reading the story. Next, in step 2, I think this is pretty obvious. Who's the protagonist in the story? Joseph. Now, again, obviously, God is the one orchestrating the scenes here. He's the one behind the scenes. He's the one sovereign over what's happening. But as we look at the story itself and the problem in the story, the problem is created for Joseph. So Joseph is the main character, the protagonist. The antagonist, then, of course, would be Potiphar's wife, right? Because she's the one creating the problem in the story, wanting Joseph to lie with her, and he's saying no, no. But she presses that, and then eventually accuses him of rape. And then I think the foils in the story probably would be Potiphar for one, who serves as a really a contrast. He did not believe Joseph; he rather believed his wife. And then the chief jailer may be another foil as well. Both of these men recognize Joseph's qualities and that the Lord was with him and elevate him to a place of prominence. So they could be possibly foils within in this particular account. Now, let's look at the character analysis in the story. And here I've got on the right of the screen the overall story. And notice I color coded it. As you can see, the light blue is the narrator comments. The green is Joseph's remarks, and then yellow is the Potiphar's wife. All right, so notice here in this story, we can just see the narrator's beginning, the middle, and the end. Joseph really only has one statement in the whole account, even though he's the main character. And then notice the Potiphar's wife has even more dialogue in this account as the antagonist in the story. And so let's consider now, as we look at the character analysis, let's describe each character. First, Joseph, right? Joseph shows his noble character within the story. We could indicate one that he found favor in the sight of his master because of God's favor in his life. Joseph shows his noble character in what he says here, that not only would he dishonor Potiphar by lying with her, but dishonor God. And again, this is the only thing he says in the story. And then a key action would be that Joseph then fled at her final advances. Okay, so he just runs rather than sin or put himself in temptation. He just takes himself completely out of the picture. Now, the antagonist, Potiphar's wife, she's this immoral, lying, conniving woman. Claims Joseph tried to lie with her. When she constantly asks him, notice verse 7, she says, lie with me. Verse 12, lie with me. And then notice verse 10 says she spoke to Joseph day after day. So this was an ongoing problem that she created by her own lust for him. And then, as I mentioned, Potiphar may be a foil, contrasting Joseph, that he didn't trust Joseph's example. First, he makes him overseer because he did trust him, but then he listens to his wife and does not trust Joseph. Chief jailer, though, he too recognizes Joseph's success and elevates him just as Potiphar did. All right. So they are examples used by the author in the story to show the impact of God being with Joseph. Joseph then has favor with his those who were over him, and they elevate him to position, foreshadowing eventually what would happen with Pharaoh, right? Okay. Now, what is God's role in the story? The sovereignty of God is clearly shown here. Notice it repeats several times. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him, verse 3. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house, verse 5. The blessing of the Lord was on all he had, verse 5. Then as you get into this part of the jail, verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. Joseph was put in charge of all the prisoners. The Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made him succeed, verse 23. So that's clearly God working and moving within the story so that Joseph would have favor and be elevated to these positions. And by the way, it connects to the broader theme of Genesis 37 to 50 of God's sovereign hand in the life of Joseph to preserve the life of his family eventually. All right. And so basically that's the character analysis. So as we look at um, assignment 2.12, let me just bring that in over here. All right. This is where you're going to do the character analysis for your passage from Ruth or Jonah. And now, again, the focus here will be just on your passage, your assigned passage. Okay. So if you are assigned Jonah chapter 3, then you're just going to look at the story of Jonah chapter 3. All right. So I put the example, again, I use the example from class here, Genesis 22. You could use this example as well from Genesis 39, but just basically go through the same steps, read and observe, then identify and categorize each character, describe each character, key actions, key statements. And again, don't just put one line or one sentence, but give, unless there's only one thing to say from the whole story, but normally there'll be a few things you could say. So just put it in the form of a paragraph. What are the key statements and the key actions? Notice both key dialogue and key actions of each character. And then for the foil, do the same, put the key narrator comments, and finally God's role in the story. All right, so I give you that example. And then here, just asking you to put down how many times you read the story, and then make observations, identify the key characters, and then their key actions, important actions and statements by each of those characters, and then God's role. Okay? So hopefully that's clear enough. Again, if not, feel free to contact me, but that's character analysis. Shouldn't take you too long to do that in your story. Probably, I would say half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that, to do this assignment within the story. Okay? All right. So let's move ahead. Let's look now at the next assignment, review for the next assignment, which is the plot analysis. All right. Assignment 2.13, plot analysis. We're going to take a look now at the plot of the story, which is where we're headed. This is the main thing. All right. The setting analysis, the scene analysis, the character analysis, all of that is intended to give us, guide and direct us to the plot. The plot is where the point of the story unfolds. If we can understand the plot of the story, then we can understand what it is, the message of the story that the author intends to communicate. All right. So let's remind ourselves of plot very quickly here as we look at the plot analysis. The definition of the plot is a sequence of events that are interrelated to one another. All right. If a story doesn't have a plot if the events aren't connected, right? You can describe particular events, but that doesn't mean you have a plot. A plot occurs when there's a connection between those events. All right. And this is an important distinction between a plot and just a story, that just describing some events would be a story, but describing events that affect one another, that are connected to one another, that together present a message, that is a plot. All right. This quote from E.M. Forster that we read in class, I think is really helpful. We've defined a story as a narrative of events arranged in their time sequence. A plot is also a narrative of events, the emphasis falling on causality. What he means by that is that the events have a connection, that one event causes or is linked to another. For example, the king died and then the queen died is a story, right? They just describe two events. But if he had said the queen died and then the queen died of grief, now we have a plot, because now that those last two words of grief make a connection between the two events. All right, so now we have a plot. The time sequence is preserved, but the sense of causality overshadows it. All right, so again, to just say the king died and then the queen died, that's simply just telling me two events. It's not giving me any message or connection with those events. But when he says the queen died of grief, now there's a connection between those two events. Okay? So that's what a story is. A story is sequence of events connected together to reveal a message, a point that the author wants to make from the story. Now, the key elements of a plot are these. One, usually there's an introduction, right? That's an opening situation where we begin to learn about the characters and the setting of the story. This is very common in scripture. There's usually an introduction. Then we have the problem. That is the conflict, complication, a danger introduced in the story. And again, remember, it's a problem for the protagonist. The main character of the story encounters some issue, some problem. And basically, then the rising action is the process of the main character trying to overcome that problem. And then often in a good story, that problem only then begins to increase, or new problems arise, or things like that. And so the rising action is sort of the attempt by the protagonist to resolve, to fix the problem, to get out of the problem. Okay. Following that, we have the climax. Okay, this is where the turning point of the story, when the problem reaches its worst. All right. So the problem's not fixed yet, but the climax is right at the point, right at the pinnacle of the story, where right before there's some sort of resolution. Okay. And so that's called the climax. Now, the resolution of the story we call the falling action. This is where the problem is overcome or resolved. So again, if we think about David and Goliath, right? The climax of that story would be just as David is rushing towards Goliath and he's twirling that sling with the rock in it, and you don't know what's going to happen, but it's right at that moment. Okay, this is it. What's going to happen next? All right, that's the climax. The resolution is as this rock is released, it hits Goliath on the head, he falls to the ground, David cuts off his head. That's the resolution of the story. That's not the climax. The climax is just before that point. All right, but then the resolution is the problem being resolved, or like in a tragedy, a Shakespearean tragedy, the problem is the end of the story, like Romeo and Juliet, where they kill themselves. All right, there's no climax. You know, the climax is at the point where they are thinking about drinking the poison. All right, like, is he going to do it? Is she going to do it? And then they do, and they die. That's it. So sometimes stories, the problem isn't fixed. It's not resolved in a good way, but perhaps in a bad way. But that still would be the resolution of the story, the falling action of the story. And then some stories will have a conclusion. Closing situation, final remarks, and often in the larger narratives, there's then a connection, like we saw in Genesis 39, which we'll see in a moment, connection to the next story. So you can think of the plot details in this way, kind of this figure. The introduction is at the start, usually the problem normally is near the beginning of the story. Then we have the rising action to the climax, and then the resolution. Probably should put the falling action near the climax, and then sometimes a conclusion in the story. Okay? All right. So the steps for plot analysis. First, identify the plot details, the things we just covered. Introduction, problem, rising action, climax, falling action. All right. And again, the key to identifying the plot details in the story is to understand the problem in the climax. All right. Where's the problem in the story? And then where are we just before the resolution, the climax of the story? That really helps us see the other plot details. Secondly, summarize the narrator comments. Now, we have already saw those in the scene analysis, the character analysis. And so now it's to take all that we've observed about the narrator comments and bring them together in seeing how might they reveal to us the message, the plot of the story. What is it that the narrator says that seems significant to the overall plot of the story? All right. And then finally, or not quite finally, actually, the step 3 is, what does the story reveal about God? Similar to what we saw in character analysis, but maybe perhaps even more to the idea of what key truths about God are revealed. And then finally, what is the author's point of the story? All right. And to do that, identify the point of the story and then answer these three questions. How does the story connect to the story before it, to the story after it, to the purpose of the book? If you're able to answer those three questions, I think you understand how your story fits within the narrative and the point of your story. Now, these statements should be a couple of sentences long. All right. Don't rehash the whole story. You don't have to write, a full chapter, just a few statements that describe how the story is linked to what came before, to what comes after, and to the purpose of the book. All right, so let's do this for Genesis 39. All right, I won't read through the story again, but we have the text here on the right. Now, we're going to identify the plot details first. Well, the introduction, I think, again, that verses 1 to 6, as we talked about before, that really sort of gives an overview, kind of rapidly goes through several years of Joseph's time in Potiphar's house, but it's not part of the main story. It's just sort of giving us an introduction, an overview of it. And then it ends with that key statement by the narrator. Now, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, because that now then leads us into the problem of the story, which comes right away. Verse 7, after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. So this is the problem. His owner, the master of the house, his wife is trying to seduce Joseph, which we know would lead to all kinds of problems if he gave in to her. And so the rising action would then be verses 8 through 11, where he refuses her advances, refuses day after day. And then verse 12 probably would be the climax, because finally one day she just grabs him. No one's in the house. Verse 12, she grabs him, says, lie with me. What would happen? This seems to be the key point of the story, but Joseph again doesn't give in. He runs off. And so the resolution of the story is actually not a good one for Joseph, at least on the surface, because she then in verses 12 and following makes up a story that he tried to rape her and he's thrown into prison. So that carries us all the way to verse 21. So in a sense, the problem was resolved in that he's no longer in Potiphar's house, but he's now in prison. And there's sort of a conclusion here, though, that even though he's in prison, the Lord is with him. And this, again, he prospers him, he succeeds. So again, a period of time is covered, but this prepares us for the next story that's going to take place. So even though Joseph is now in prison, after being charged with rape, things are going okay for him. But he's still in prison. But yet God is setting him up for what is to come. Okay, so I would plot it out like this on your, so as you notice here on the screen, I like to kind of do this visually as well. All right, where I put the verses there, which describe, each of these points: the introduction in the beginning, problem in verse 7, the rising action, verses 8 to 11, the climax in verse 12, when she finally grabs him, falling action, he's accused, thrown in jail, and conclusion. All right, and so sometimes what I'll do is go by the scenes and just put in the verses. And notice, by the way, the plot elements won't always follow just by the scenes. All right, so for example, scene 1 includes the problem and the rising action. Scene 2 includes the climax and the falling action. The falling action continues on in scene 3. All right. Okay, so these are the plot details identified in the story. And then the next step is to summarize the narrator comments. And again, over and over, the narrator states Yahweh was with Joseph, and that he prospered Joseph, and that the Potiphar saw this, and then also the jailer saw this. So that seems to be a key focus in this account in the narrative in terms of the message of the story. Trinity, the sovereignty of God, is clearly demonstrated, and again connects to the broader theme. That's what we identify in character analysis. And then finally, okay, what is the author's point in the story? Well, clearly God is at work in Joseph's life to direct him where God wants him to be. God wanted him in Potiphar's house, and then events in Potiphar's house led him to the prison. And we're going to see that this sets up, while in prison, he is able to meet the baker and cupbearer, which eventually leads him to Pharaoh. All right. Which is where God wanted him all along, just as God granted him favor in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar elevated him to second in command over all his household, as Joseph said. And then notice it repeats: Joseph's in prison. God is with him, grants him favor before the head jailer. The head jailer puts him in charge of all the prisons. So again, he's just under the head jailer. And then we're going to see that pattern again followed, even with Pharaoh, where Pharaoh will elevate Joseph to second in all the land of Egypt. All right. So we can see God's hand moving in a particular way within a pattern in Joseph's life. And eventually, being under Pharaoh, God uses Joseph to preserve Jacob's family, in order to be able to keep his promise to Abraham that his family would grow and be blessed. All right. So we can see that how Genesis 34 really, I really just talked about here how Genesis 34 connects to the story as a whole, right? How does it connect to the story as a whole? Well, the purpose of the book, well, that's what I just described. God's faithfulness to fulfill his promise to Abraham by using Joseph to preserve the family of Jacob. Now, specifically, how does this story in Genesis 38 connect to what came before? Sorry, Genesis 39. Genesis 38 was the story of Judah and Tamar. So how does Genesis 39 connect to that? You remember that story where Judah lies with Tamar because Tamar wants to continue the family line because her husband had died and brother refused. So Genesis 38:1 begins in the same way. Judah went down by his own choice to a particular place. Genesis 39, when Joseph was taken down, right? Similar wording. And then in chapter 37, Joseph was taken from Israel, and Judah is the reason for that. Remember, Judah was the one say, hey, let's sell Joseph. So Judah really is a foil as well, in that he's the one who sold Joseph into slavery. So he's the one that started Joseph's problem in his life. And then Judah commits this act with Tamar, where he gives in to immorality, as a contrast to Joseph, who does not. All right, but I think the main idea is broader than that. Even certainly, there's that comparison we can see between the two stories, but also as well, Genesis 38 really shows the beginnings. At the end of that story, Judah tells Tamar, she's more righteous than I. And I think there is a point in Judah's life where he recognizes he was not following God. And Judah becomes later really a good guy, in that we see later when he and his brothers meet with Joseph, and how Judah offers himself in place of Benjamin, and Judah's the one who asks forgiveness. And so we really see a turnaround with Judah. And I think chapter 38 is intended to give us what it was that turned Judah to the Lord. And even again, as a contrast to Joseph. Now, how does Genesis 39 to connect to Genesis 40, where I think, again, that story, it sets up the next one in chapter 40 and 41 of the baker and the cupbearer, and then the finding himself before Pharaoh. And we already talked about how it connects to the purpose of the book. Okay? So that's the plot analysis using the Joseph narrative, Genesis 39 as an example. And again, remember, just understanding Genesis 39 is not self-contained. It's part of the bigger narrative of Genesis 37 to 50, which itself is part of the bigger narrative of the Pentateuch. But we can see even in Genesis 39, there is a problem, a climax, a resolution along the way. It's one of the smaller stories that connected along the way to the broader story of how God worked in Joseph's life to use him to be a source of deliverance to the family of Jacob during the famine so that the family remained alive and continued to grow. And God then showing his ongoing commitment to his promise to Abraham to give him many descendants, to give him a land, and to bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him, as part of the broader theme of the Pentateuch and really the Old Testament um, as well, and leading into the New Testament. Okay, so that's the plot of the story, the plot analysis. And again, hopefully that makes sense for to you as we consider um, assignment 213. Okay, that's the plot analysis. We see that here again. It's just for your assigned passage from Ruth or Jonah. Right. So if you have Ruth chapter 2, you're just going to do this for Ruth chapter 2. All right. And you'll follow the steps as I again remind you, describe them here, the identify the plot details, summarize the narrator comments. And then I gave you an example. Again, this one was from Genesis 22, which we looked at in class. You can use Genesis 39 as well. And then I give you a place in your assignment to do it. Do the step 1, step 2, etc. Okay. So again, hopefully that makes sense. And if you have any questions, as I said, please feel free to message me. Many of you do that, and I appreciate that. It's not a problem at all. It's not a burden at all. I want to help in any way I can. And if you really get stuck and you need to speak face to face, let me know. We can set up a time on Zoom or something, and I can help you with your passage, in particular, if you have questions about that. So again, we're going to, Lord willing, gather next time. Will be August 9th. Is when we'll be able to gather in person and should be able to meet all through August. I plan to be home during the month of August, so should be able to meet then together each Friday morning at this time and continue looking at the following assignments to review that. So I do trust that these provide some help for you by review and looking at these things. Looking forward to seeing you again face to face, at least by Zoom, August 9th, and then eventually in December when we are together in our module 2 preaching labs and looking then at the next topic in our series. But I do want to wish all you brothers well. I want to again express my appreciation for you and just stay with it. Also, too, feel free to let me know any ways I could be praying for you. Please pray for me on my trip. I'll be in Turkey with my wife, as I mentioned before, and then also in Pakistan a couple of weeks. So pray for my health and safety. That would be a fruitful time of ministry as well. All right. Appreciate you, brothers. God bless you.